Hello guys, matchup is a very important thing to understand in competitive Pokemon, and no, not just because it allows you to chalk losses up to a bad matchup. The real reason it's important to understand if you have a good or bad matchup is that it changes the way you should play. Generally, if you have a really good matchup, it's better to play safely and minimize risk. If you have a really bad matchup, you need to take more risks and go for more hard reads. And if you don't have an extreme matchup, it's best to make middle ground plays most turns. For more information on how to play in different matchups, check the description for my guide to middle ground plays and when to and when not to make them. This video, though, is not about how to play. It's about how to determine whether you have a good, bad, or about even matchup. I offer competitive Pokemon tutoring, and something I've noticed is that a lot of my clients struggle to identify when they have a good matchup or a bad one. Oftentimes, they'll play a really bad matchup too safely and lose, or take unnecessary risks in a very strong matchup. Frequently, when I ask them if they have a good matchup or not, they can't even answer. It's not something they've considered, and as we've established, it's definitely something you should consider if you like winning. Now in this video, I'll explain two solid methods to determine how good or bad your matchup is on Team Preview, and we'll walk through some examples. Also, the background footage is from a recent live stream. I stream every Thursday night and Saturday morning. The easiest way to tell a matchup is if you've played it before. If you run into a team you've faced before, using a team you've used before, you probably have a pretty good idea of who has the upper hand, which of your Pokemon are threats, and which of the opponent's Pokemon are threats. Unfortunately, this will rarely be the case. More often than not, all the information you have are the 6 Pokemon on your opponent's team, and of course, your own team. When you see a full stall, it could be a real stall team or a fake stall team with a ton of choice items. You never know. But you can make an educated guess based on usage stats and team members. You can't rely too heavily on these guesses when determining matchup though, as some differences can be pretty major. Guessing that a Moltres is physically defensive and it turns out to be specially defensive probably won't break your game, but expecting a Kyurem to be choice specs and it turns out to be Dragon Dance, that very well might be the end of you. There's always uncertainty when determining matchup. For that reason, unless you're confident that you know your opponent's team, it's good not to play too safely or too risky at first. Very few matchups are so good that you can win without ever risking anything, and very few matchups are so bad that you need to start making hard reads right off the bat. Take a few turns to assess and gather information, and learn about your opponent. Still, it is very important to at least have an idea of how your matchup looks on Team Preview, even if you don't have the benefit of a few turns of information. So let's go over method 1. I'll call this the rigorous assessment method. This method has 3 main steps. 1. Assess how strong every offensive Pokemon is. 2. Assess how strong every defensive Pokemon is. And 3. Assess who has the better hazard situation. For step 1, looking at how strong every offensive Pokemon is, the important thing to ask yourself, how can my opponent switch into this threat? If you have a Choice Scarf and Amorous, and your opponent has 4 Fairy Weak Pokemon, that's great, but if their last 2 Pokemon are an Assault Vest Galarian Slowking and especially Defensive Corviknight, your Enamorous is basically offensively useless, at least until those 2 are dead. If you have a Choice Specs Kyurem now, and your opponent's only switch into Ice Beam is a Hoopa that might or might not be Assault Vest, which can only switch in once or twice, that's very good, and you can safely assume Kyurem is a major threat. The big thing to remember here is that it doesn't matter if an offensive threat does well against the majority of your opponent's team. That's a mistake I see a lot of people make. They look at whether a Pokemon's good or not based on how many Pokemon it's good against. That's not how you want to look at offensive Pokemon. If your opponent has an easy way to hard wall it, it's not very good. Let's take a look at an example. Here I'm using Choice Band Scizor, Choice Scarf Roaring Moon, Eject Button Hatterene, Rocky Helmet Landorus, Eject Button Specially Defensive Glowking, and Modest Subtext Kyurem with Terra Ground Earth Power and Freeze Dry. If you want to see the full team, that's in the description. As we go through different examples, I'll give brief descriptions of the team like this one, but the full team will always be in the description. Now on my side, my offensive Pokemon are Kyurem, Roaring Moon, and Scizor. On my opponent's side, the offensive Pokemon are Cinderace, Hoopa, and Kyurem. Let's start with my side. Roaring Moon looks useless offensively. Corviknight, Clefable, and Gliscor can all stop it basically forever. Choice Band Scizor is also nearly useless offensively here, since there's a Corviknight, and I'm running Defog instead of Close Combat. So even if I could pressure the Gliscor, Corviknight and Gliscor together are going to be too much for Scizor to deal with. If Corviknight dies though, Bullet Punch could be great. Lastly, Kyurem looks amazing. My opponent has one real switch in, Hoopa, which has no reliable way of healing and can only switch in a couple times. Now, for my opponent's side, Cinderace looks moderately threatening. I don't have any great switch in other than Landorus, but Roaring Moon and my eject button users can switch in a few times as well. Hoopa is not too threatening, assuming it's Assault Vest. Landorus, Hatterene, and Roaring Moon switch in comfortably a few times each. Lastly, my opponent's Kyurem looks moderately threatening, but given I have a specially defensive Glow-King into Scizor, I don't think a special set will be an issue. That being said, a Dragon Dance set with Terra, Fire, or Electric could be big trouble. Now, for step 2, determining how good each defensive Pokemon looks. And here, you want to just look how effectively it walls members of your opponent's team. Or if you're looking from your opponent's perspective, how well these walls effectively wall Pokemon on your team. So starting off here, my Glow-King looks pretty nice. It can come in forever on Clefable and Corviknight, and it also does a good job of scouting Kyurem. Hatterene looks really nice here since it can switch in on Hoopa many times. Landorus is good, mostly for switching into Cinderace, which nothing else can comfortably do. On my opponent's side, Clefable looks quite poor. The only thing it switches in against comfortably is Roaring Moon, which wasn't a threat anyway. Gliscor is pretty good here. I have Ice Beam on Glow-King, but it switches in well against Hatterene, Landorus, Roaring Moon, and Scizor. Lastly, Corviknight is very solid as well. It switches in against everything except Hatterene and Kyurem. Now, before we move on to step 3, I just want to note that you should do a quick check for defensive utility on your offensive Pokemon and offensive utility on your defensive Pokemon. Sometimes your Iron Valiant, an offensive Pokemon, will be very defensively important, such as walling a Specs Dragapult Draco Meteor. Or perhaps you face a team that forgot to run a Poison or Steel type, and now your defensive Toxapex with Toxic is the ultimate offensive threat. For example, in this game, if my opponent was using a Tornadus Therian instead of a Corviknight, then Glow-King would be a legitimate offensive threat with Sludge Bomb plus Ice Beam. It's very uncommon, though, for an offensive Pokemon's defensive utility or a defensive Pokemon's offensive utility to be so significant that it changes your view of the matchup, but it can happen, so be aware. Now, for step 3, you want to ask yourself how easy it is for each side to set hazards, remove hazards, and how damaging those hazards are to the other side. Unlike assessing your opponent's offensive threats or walls, this is really hard to do for your opponent's team. Maybe your opponent is super weak to hazards, or maybe they're running heavy-duty boots on every Pokemon. This step is still good for assessing how your team fares against the hazards, though. You can often tell if your opponent has Spikes and Stealth Rock, or just one. Or if they have Sticky Web or Toxic Spikes, this is usually quite obvious as well. Ask yourself how big of a problem this is for your team. It may be important in determining the overall matchup. In this example, hazards aren't a big deal. I doubt my opponent is running Spikes and Stealth Rock alongside Cinderace and Corviknight. Furthermore, I'm almost certainly going to Terra Ground Kyurem in this matchup to better handle Clefable Moonblast and Corviknight Body Press, so bringing in Kyurem on Stealth Rock won't be terrible to deal with. In most cases, once you've assessed the potency of your defensive and offensive Pokemon, those of your opponent, and assessed the hazard situation, it will probably be obvious who has the better matchup. In this case, I have the better matchup. Hazards are not a major factor, no walls are exceedingly dominant, and my Kyurem can break very quickly, while my opponent has nothing that can break quickly. This isn't a super dominant matchup though, definitely not the type of game I can hang back completely risk-free and win. Hoopa and my opponent's Kyurem will break through the team eventually if I don't exert enough pressure and win first. Now, this method 1 is solid, but it can sometimes take a bit too long. Team preview doesn't last forever. Furthermore, there's a lot of redundancy in this method. You assess how well your breakers do against your opponent's walls, and then assess how well those walls handle your team. So I prefer method 2, which is faster and simpler. I call this the quick assessment method. In this method, you just focus on offensive threats and the hazard situation. You discard the analysis of defensive Pokemon. Like the previous method, you look at each offensive Pokemon and ask yourself, how do I switch into this, or how does my opponent switch into this? Whichever side's offensive Pokemon face less resistance, almost always that side has the better matchup. And the degree to which that resistance is different determines how good or bad the matchup is. Now, this may sound foolish, like I'm disregarding walls completely, but that's not the case. Walls and defensive Pokemon will be considered through how well they counter the offensive Pokemon. Let's go through an example. In this game, my offensive Pokemon pretty much includes my entire team. I've got a Mega Sceptile, a Choice Scarf Hisuian Samurott, Phytinium Z Tapu Lele, Smackdown Stealth Rock Landorus Therian, Assault Vest Melmetal, and Sub Swarm Quiver Dance Volcarona. My opponent's offensive Pokemon include Tapu Lele, Urshifu, Mega Tyranitar, and potentially Garchomp depending on the set. Let's start with my team. My Sceptile is basically useless here. It gets hard-walled by Glowking and Moltres. My Tapu Lele is pretty good since I have Psyshock for Glowking. My Samurott looks quite decent as well since the only water resist is Urshifu. Landorus looks nice as well since everything hates taking either Smackdown or Earthquake. Melmetal is looking pretty useless, at least offensively though. I can't see it ever getting past Moltres. Volcarona looks even worse since I have nothing to hit Urshifu or Moltres. So, my Samurott, Tapu Lele, and Landorus all look solid, but my Sceptile, Melmetal, and Volcarona are all almost completely offensively useless. Now, let's look at my opponent. Tyranitar doesn't look great. It struggles with Landorus and Melmetal. Garchomp, if it has Swords Dance, is very threatening. Nothing on my team can comfortably switch in. Tapu Lele, depending on the set, could be threatening. Phytinium Z would be the worst case scenario, since it can break past Melmetal, which is my best switch-in. And finally, Urshifu. I completely forgot to prepare for Urshifu when building this team, and it absolutely cooks me. Choice Scarf is the most common set, it makes sense with my opponent's team, and it can outspeed and one-shot almost everything on my team. And the things it doesn't one-shot, it needs very minimal chip. It clicks Surging Strikes freely, and the only Pokemon that can switch in is Sceptile, which is very easy for my opponent to counter. Notice how I'm assessing how good offensive Pokemon are by how I would switch into them? Remember what I said earlier, it doesn't matter that Sceptile is very good against Urshifu, or Garchomp, or Tyranitar. My opponent can switch into it easily with Glowking and Moltres. In that analysis, also notice that Glowking and Moltres, two walls, were considered even though we didn't explicitly go out of our way to look at them. Now, in this scenario, which side faces more resistance? This answer is unfortunately easy. I do. My opponent has Urshifu, which effortlessly cuts through my entire team. I have nothing that can break nearly as quickly. This is a really bad matchup, and to win, I'm probably going to have to play more aggressively, take more risks, and go for some hard reads. Let's do one more example. In this game, I've got Electrium Z Tapu Koko, a modest Choice Specs Iron Valiant with Vacuum Wave, a standard Mega Tyranitar, a specially defensive Ferrothorn, a physically defensive Landorus, and a physically defensive Galarian Slowking. On my side, the offensive Pokemon are Tapu Koko, Iron Valiant, and Mega Tyranitar. Tapu Koko isn't looking great here. It does have Hidden Power Ice for Landorus, and the Electrium Z can do a lot of damage to something, But with Kyurem, Ferrothorn, and Galarian Slowking, there are a lot of things Koko has to get past. It still provides electric terrain for Iron Valiant, which is good, but I'm not expecting it to be a major progress maker. Now, Iron Valiant looks really, really good here. It can one-shot almost everything on the team, with the one exception of Glowking, but that's where Tyranitar comes in. Tyranitar can trap and kill Glowking with Pursuit, a Dark-type move that hits before the opponent switches out. That means that Tyranitar looks really good here, as it can eliminate the one thing standing in the way of Iron Valiant. Now let's go to my opponent's side. Lopunny is moderately threatening here. Defensive Landorus and defensive Glowking can switch in a few times, but not forever. I also don't have anything that outspeeds Mega Lopunny, although I do have Vacuum Wave on Iron Valiant. Kingambit isn't a big concern for me here. Landorus comfortably switches in a few times, Koko can even switch in if needed, and Kingambit also really struggles to find entry opportunities, especially since my Glowking is defensive and has Fire EMZ with Fire Blast. Landorus isn't too hard to deal with, as I can just switch in with my own Landorus or Ferrothorn. Lastly, Kyurem. Whether Kyurem is a threat or not really depends on the set. Substitute or choice specs isn't a problem at all. Tyranitar and specially defensive Ferrothorn can easily handle it. But Dragon Dance would be very, very tough to deal with. If I were to let it set up on Ferrothorn, or when forcing out Landorus, that could be really bad. This matchup isn't strongly favoring one player or the other based on the information I have, but I'll want to keep an eye on Kyurem. If it's choice specs or sub, I'd say my matchup is slightly good. And if it's Dragon Dance, I'd say my matchup is slightly bad. This sounds like a long explanation, but really once you have enough practice doing team preview matchup analysis, this whole assessment takes about 10 seconds or so. Once you've done a matchup analysis, you should then consider what to lead with, but that's a separate topic, and I'll link a video on how to pick leads in the description as well. One warning I have is that this matchup analysis should not determine how you play the entire game. It gives you an idea of how to play until your circumstances change. If you think you have a great matchup against a stall team, then all of a sudden your Iron Valiant dies to a Choice Specs Blissey Hyper Beam, don't keep playing safely, the game is not going well. Similarly, if you assess that you have a really bad matchup on Team Preview, suppose your only breaker is Kyurem and then you're facing a Bronzong team, well, if you freeze the Bronzong and then kill it while it struggles to escape the ice, don't keep playing super risky for the rest of the game. You're probably in a really good spot now. No assumptions made at Team Preview should be kept if something significant in the game changes. Well, that's about all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something, and if you did, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Now, before I end the video, I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to show you the team preview of a game of mine, and I want you to tell me whether my matchup is good, bad, or about even. The team I use, like all others in this video, is in the description. Leave your answer and tell me why in a comment, and I'll respond letting you know how you did. If you want to check yourself, I'll also have a write-up explaining my team preview matchup analysis at the bottom of the description. Thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.